Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative at OrbitCon. I'm really glad you're all here. So a little bit about this panel. Founded in 2017 by Marissa McCool and Callie Wright, the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative is a media network of transgender podcasters whose mission is to donate and platform equipment and visibility to new voices in the movement. In this panel discussion, find out how the initiative came to be, what it does, and why trans visibility podcasting is so important. All right, y'all, go ahead and take on this issue and let me know if you need anything.
Great, thanks, Benny. So before we begin, I figured we'd go around and give the audience brief auto bios. So I'll start. My name is Trav Mamone. I'll be leading this panel discussion. I'm bisexual and non-binary, and my pronouns are they, them, their. I host the By Any Means podcast, which is a weekly interview-based show, and I co-host the bi-weekly Biskeptical podcast with Morgan Stringer, which is a news commentary show, and both of my shows are part of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative.
All right, I'll go. My name's Marissa Alexa McCool. I am a Penn graduate, a published author, and a multiple podcast host. I host the Inciting Incident podcast, as well as the Sister Getting Out of Hand, and I produce 4 other podcasts on my network. And yeah, my pronouns are she, her. Callie?
Hi, I'm Callie Wright. My pronouns are she, her, and I host the Gay Theist Manifesto podcast along with the wonderful Ari Stillman. I am a trans woman, came out about 5-ish years ago, started doing the podcast about 3 years ago, and do the podcasting thing, the public speaking thing, going around talking about queer stuff, trans stuff, atheist stuff, secular stuff, social justice stuff, and all of those wonderful things.
Okay, great. So for those that don't know, what is the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative?
So me and Callie talk a lot, imagine that. And I think I've been on her show like 7 times at this point, and I forget what it was just after. It was after some time that we hung out. We were joking back and forth like, yeah, let's make our own media network with blackjack and hookers. And after that, it was kind of like, why don't we? Why don't we make our own media network specifically for transgender podcasters and content creators? And Callie, you can take it from there, basically, about what the mission of it was.
Yeah, so basically the underrepresented voices are underrepresented basically everywhere in society, right? And podcasting is not an exception to that. I mean, there are trans podcasters out there. There are, women podcasters and people of color and all of that sort of stuff. But like many other spaces, it's very, very dominated by white cishet men, right? And so as trans folks who podcast, obviously we sort of exist in a special niche of podcasting. We have unique experiences that a lot of folks may not understand. And so it just kind of made sense that we come together, if nothing else, to just provide moral support and community to other trans folks who are doing podcasting. And also other content creation too. I mean, we've talked with bloggers and people who do YouTube and that kind of stuff. It's podcast focused because that's kind of our thing. But I think it's valuable to get trans folks involved at all levels of content creation. And so, at the very least, we thought it would be a good idea to just sort of come together and form a group where, folks who are more experienced, like Marissa, myself, Trav, could help out and give advice to folks who are either just starting out or really want to, but might not know how, or, people who think that maybe podcasting is more difficult than it is. One of my favorite things about podcasting is that the barrier to entry is, generally speaking, very low. I mean, you still have to have a computer and that kind of stuff. So there is a barrier to entry, but it's much lower than a lot of other media forms. I mean, if you have a computer, you can get into podcasting for like $40 or $50 and like $5 a month for a hosting account, right? And so I think that's a very valuable place where the barrier to entry is low for trans folks' voices to be elevated. And so it's really valuable, I think, for like all of those reasons put together.
Great. So what kind of stuff does the initiative do? What do y'all do?
Well, we have a messenger for the Facebook page that generally fields interest in either creators who are already out there making stuff if they want to ally up with us, or people who are looking to start creating content and pretty much what Callie described, that they don't know how or how to get started, or they have started and don't really know how to attract more viewers. And the nice thing about it is we started with like 5 of us, and I think there's about 20 now. And they're all at various different levels of experience. Some of the people we brought on had never podcasted before, and now they're doing pretty well. And sometimes people even come out to us there, which is one that we had recently. So it provides a community within a community, so to speak, a space where people don't have to stop and explain everything or clarify some Trans 101 pretty much, which is what Callie and I do a lot on the speaking circuit, and we're generally willing to do. But it's also nice to have a space where we don't have to do that and can also bring in new faces to the movement, and already have some people with experience who can say, oh, well, if you need a guest, here's a whole bunch of guests with experience and reaches and platforms who can both point you in the direction of good guests and, of course, be on each other's shows. And every show that's on our network has at least one trans creator. That's kind of the point.
Yeah, one of my favorite things is sort of demystifying the process around podcasting for folks, because I think a lot of people get the idea that podcasting is some dark art that like is super complicated and really difficult. And like of all of the content creation mediums there are, I would venture to say blogging is probably the easiest. But I mean, at least in terms of practicality and like what it takes to get started. But podcasting is also pretty easy. And, people think that there's so much work that has to go into getting guests. And sometimes there is, but like most of the time it's just as easy as shooting somebody a Facebook message. Right. And I think sort of doing that demystifying of podcasting and getting like, wow, this is something that I can do. And I think the other thing too is just sort of getting the opportunity to commiserate with other trans folks. It's cool to go into a space that is ostensibly about one thing and find community around another thing. Like if I go to a comic convention and like, obviously like I'm there because I love Star Trek and I love sci-fi and I love nerdy cartoons and stuff like that. But to find and commiserate with other queer and trans folks in that space is just cool on its own. Right. And so doing the same thing with podcasting, getting, this medium has literally changed the course of my life. I just married a woman I met because of my podcast, right? So I'm super passionate about the medium, and it also just gives me a really cool excuse to hang out with other trans folks and make friends and commiserate and build community around that.
Yeah, the community that we've sort of been lucky enough to cultivate, not just brought you and Celeste together, but I did the photography for your wedding, and I brought my girlfriend who was a new trans podcaster with the initiative, and Trav was there, and like we had a third of the initiative there for your wedding, and it wasn't even a question of whether or not we were going to go. And Ari, and like there's a picture of you, me, and Celeste and Ari. Ari is our mutual co-host, and it's like that goes on Family Wall because that's how close we all are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So who else is involved in the initiative?
Well, me and Callie co-founded it, and we each have our 2 shows. Our mutual co-host, Ari Stillman, has the show with Callie, which is the Gay Theist Manifesto, and the show with me, which is The Sister Getting Out of Hand, as well as their own show, the SJW Circle Jerk. Trav, year 2 that you mentioned. My husband's show, For Trans Men. My girlfriend's show, The Interesting Life of Pris. We have Polyam Radio. We have Callie's other show, Query, which is on hiatus right now, I believe.
The queer side.
Yeah, we have Sasha, who creates, I think it's called Princess of Darkness, and that's a YouTube show. And Callie, I know there's other ones. I might have to look it up.
Odd Atheist Friends podcast?
Yes, with Eric.
Yeah, there's lots.
Yeah, there is. And it's gotten to the point that we don't even know personally all the people who are on it, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, because Marissa and I had a conversation the other day about like what exactly we want this thing to be, because, we had kind of floated the idea like, let's start a 501c3, make it a nonprofit, take donations, give people money and that kind of stuff. And like, that's a whole lot of work, because I've done that with a nonprofit that I helped found and helped run for about a year. And so, we kind of decided that going that level isn't necessarily the thing for us right now. We're just sort of about building and cultivating community and just kind of giving advice to people and, getting people started, helping people sustain. Because, I think I forget the statistic. I'd have to get on the internet to look it up, but it's just a ridiculously high number of podcasts never make it past like 2 or 3 episodes.
Yeah.
Because, people get discouraged, people run into complications they didn't anticipate and that kind of stuff. So a lot of it's kind of about getting people over that hump too, and just saying like, hey, here's a couple of folks who have been doing this for years and like, we're doing okay and you can too. So like, what can we do to help you? So like, that's what it's really about at this point.
Yeah, here are the other names. I pulled it up. Maddie Love, who has Atheist Talk, which is an AM radio show out of Minnesota, and also hosts a Minnesota Trans Atheist podcast. Caleb Ehring, who hosts Beyond Gender. Sarah Austin, who hosts Sarah Talk, and Sophie and Mara. Like I said, I mentioned them, Polyam Radio, but Sophie just started a show called Dungeons and Queers.
Oh my God, best show name ever.
Kaya Kramer has Queer Life Radio. Joe and Wheels have Got It Memorized. And Ash Barker is our newest member who hosts Queer for Queer.
Nice. Cool. Now, I remember at one point you mentioned earlier about starting 501c3 and getting donations and stuff. Was that basically to help up-and-coming podcasters get equipment? Because even though, Callie, you said that it's very simple to start a podcast, you do, I don't know, good microphones are pretty pricey, so what's the latest on that?
Well, that's kind of like a long-term, aim for the stars kind of goal, because okay. I had an idea before Marissa and I had talked. There was an idea that I was kind of rattling around in my head about trying to raise money to get equipment for folks who want to do content creation. So like, for a blogger, maybe like an entry-level laptop. For a podcaster, like a Blue Snowball microphone, which is a microphone that's pretty nice, but not super expensive. Right. Or, like a $50 or $60 webcam for somebody who wants to start doing YouTube videos and that kind of stuff. And so, that I think that's probably a long-term goal, that we want to turn it into something where we can do that. And, but like, there's so much that goes into that, and figuring out like, how to pick who gets what money and all of that, like super, super complicated questions. So at this point, I think we've just kind of decided that like just sort of cultivating that community and being like a moral support and encouragement and advice kind of community is mostly what we're going for at this point. But that kind of stuff is at least not out of the question for the future, I think.
Yeah, we've been working toward that, in the sense that, if you look at the fact that most trans people don't live in places that they're legally protected from, things like employment or housing, or just being able to walk down the street without getting assaulted, there is an economic disadvantage there. So with Callie and I, and our mutually and relatively decent economic status, I at least personally felt like we would be doing a disservice if we didn't try to turn that into helping other people be able to be heard and have a platform. And, $40 to $50 to some people may seem like nothing, but to some people, even ones we know, it's really difficult to sort of find even a few extra dollars. So we try to be there both for content creators and, like the fundraiser we did in the holiday season, people that aren't connected to us in any way, but are trans or have trans family that need help.
Cool. And let's talk about that campaign. It was to raise funds for a neurodivergent, gender nonconforming kid to go to a special school, right?
Yeah. A friend of mine in the Twin Cities here had was in a relationship with a trans woman who had a 5-year-old child, and the public system was just not working very well for them. And the kid was very gender nonconforming. We didn't want to apply the label trans, but definitely, some days wanted to wear skirts and some days wanted to put on makeup. So dealing with that in public school, even at 5 years old, can be incredibly difficult. I think all three of us have experienced dealing with what that can be, just existing in that kind of space. And once again, the mother had just lost her job, and it's that economic disadvantage again. And they found this place called the Gaia School, which is a school that's very much student focused, and it allows them to learn at their own pace and freely express themselves. But it was also a decent amount of money a month. So when I heard that story, given that we hadn't done any fundraising for new podcasters, most of the podcasters that we had brought on had their own equipment or were able to obtain it. It was like, well, it's the holidays, and here is a local person, at least to me and a couple of the other people in the initiative, who need help. And if we're looking to help people, especially during this time of year, I think this is a really good way to make a difference in somebody's life. So we decided to try to raise 6 months of tuition, and we didn't quite make it, but we raised enough that they could get into school. And I believe I got sent a message from the mother that said the child whose name I won't say for obvious reasons came to their mother and said, "Do I get to stay here?" And the mother said, "Yes, because of our friends, you're safe now." And that was worth every second that went into trying to help that family.
And that's like, at the end of the day, stuff like that is what it's about, right? Like, because being welcomed into the community as I have, I mean, I know how valuable that is for me, even as someone who, I mean, obviously I have some level of vulnerability being a trans person and a visibly trans person. But that's really kind of the only mark I have against me. Like I'm white, I'm relatively financially okay. And, I'm binary. And so like, I have a lot of privileges, right? But even knowing that, being welcomed into the community and realizing like, wow, these are people that I can trust. And these are people who do have my best interests at heart. Like, I know how valuable that is for me, even as a relatively privileged person. And so, for folks who don't have those privileges and advantages that I do, like I feel a responsibility to do what I can to try to help create that space for others. And I think, if we're kind of zooming out at like the overarching goal of what this is about, I think that's it, right?
Yep, exactly. Okay. The next question on my list requires me to do my devil's advocate voice, so give me just a second. Okay. Hi, I'm Dave Rubin. Why create a podcast network just for trans people? Isn't that cisphobia?
Yes.
Hashtag classical liberalism.
Yes. The answer is yes, it is cisphobic. Unapologetically no.
Oh, it's funny to me because I do have a podcast that is very, very assertively for trans people by trans people. We have no non-trans people on the show, and that's the point. And at first, if you have a complete lack of social awareness and context, you might be like, well, isn't that unfair? Why don't you have the cis perspective? It's like, well, look at literally everything else, and I'm sure you'll find it. So the fact that there are relatively few voices in the community as compared to some of the other demographics, we wanted to help platform more trans voices, because I know when I was coming out, I was aware of Callie and Ari, and that was it. So if we, allying together helps not just content creators, but other trans folk out there who listen to podcasts, and then they can go, oh, well, I listened to Callie's show and she said she was part of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative. And you look up on our Facebook page and there's 20 shows that you can access. So it's about providing accessibility to creators as well as listeners.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it goes back to the same argument that we use for any group that needs, if not a space of its own, at least a space where that group is at the center of things, right? So trans folks need trans-centered spaces or trans-exclusive spaces, et cetera, right? Because we don't get that in society. 99% of the time when I'm in the room, at least as far as I know, I'm the only trans person in the room, right? And obviously I could be wrong. We can't make assumptions necessarily, but like, I know what it's like to be the only person in the group with that sort of experience, and to be even around people who don't make me feel like the token trans, I still kind of am the token trans, right? And so having a space that is centered on those experiences and focused on those experiences, where I feel like, yes, I'm with other trans folks. So like, maybe now we can just like hang out and talk about podcasting and Star Trek and not be completely focused on, okay, cool, other trans people, let's talk about being trans, because we don't do enough of that already, you know?
Yeah. How many times have one of us been invited to a con to represent the trans experience, and our whole mission is to talk about being trans? And I get that we have to do that because we need to make our experience accessible. But at the same time, it's nice to not have to stop every 6 seconds in our own space and be like, okay, here's what cis means, here's what transgender means. Like we have to do that so much in our everyday lives that having one space where we're not having to stop every 6 seconds to define words and clarify things is necessary, because the outside world is mostly focused on straight, cis, and hetero relationships. So when we put that, when we get together, it's not like when you sit and watch TV and every commercial is targeted towards straight couples, and you walk into, say, a wedding shop and everything there is targeted towards straight couples, unless you go to a queer specific space. And those are not nearly as ubiquitous or, as well known. So we try to create that because sometimes we just don't want to be a freaking walking dictionary.
Well, and like, quick sidebar to illustrate that, a friend of mine decided to throw a party for Celeste and I at his house, since we had an out-of-town wedding and folks couldn't make it. And so he got these 2 bride wedding toppers. And in order to be able to do that, he had to buy 2 sets of straight wedding toppers so he could get 2 brides. Like, and I had an organizer of a conference once. I reached out and said, hey, this conference looks pretty cool. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Callie. Queer, trans, atheist. I talk about all of those things. If, you'd be interested in having me, I'd love to do the con, whatever. And the response I got was literally like, well, we already have a trans person, so that perspective is covered. And, and
we got our token trans.
Right. And so, like Marissa was saying, obviously the one-on-one stuff is valuable, right? Because I mean, this is a new concept to a lot of people. So I don't begrudge doing that, right? Like, I wouldn't have the podcast or go to speak at these cons if I thought it was a bad thing, or if it was like, oh my God, we got to do this again, I hate this so much. Like, that's not what it's about, right? But it is a lot of emotional labor. And so sometimes it's very nice to be able to just like go into a room, whether virtually or in meet space, and just like be with other folks who understand that experience, and where we can commiserate, 1, on that experience, and 2, just like, since we're all trans, it's a little easier to forget that we are for a minute and just like be people. Like, maybe that sounds bad, but like, I hope my meaning is clear there. Folks get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying. In fact, let's talk about trans visibility in the atheist movement. Like, what are your two what are y'all's experiences? Because I think the 3 of us, along with Ari Stillman, are like the token trans atheist podcasters, and we're the ones who end up on all the cis people's podcasts doing the trans 101 thing. I mean, I've definitely been on, all the times that I've been on, other people's podcasts, explaining what non-binary is, what trans is, what cisgender is, and all that stuff. They've been pleasant experiences. I've never had somebody say, well, actually, to me. But after a while, it does seem like, can we talk about, I don't know, Steven Universe or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's important to make a distinction between the like in real life atheist community versus the online atheist community. And obviously I can only speak for myself here because I have heard folks who have had radically different experiences than my own within real life atheist communities.
Right.
But in my experience, there is a very, very big distinction when I go to conferences and meetup groups and stuff like that. Generally speaking, my experiences have been overwhelmingly positive. I have definitely had some experiences where people creep me out a little bit, or said some kind of ridiculous and insensitive things. But at the very least, in most spaces I've existed in real life, in real life is probably a bad way to describe it because online is real life, but in meet space, the experiences I've had have largely been good. In my experience, it's the online communities that are where like the most toxicity exists. And I mean, I've heard plenty of stories about meet space toxicity and awfulness, but that's been just a tiny slice of my experience, thankfully.
Well, when we're in the position that we are outspoken about our identity and we have the support networks that we do, I feel like putting ourselves out there is really important so that the people who don't have one person supporting who they are, and Callie and I get emails like that probably every day from people who don't have that they live with parents who won't acknowledge their identity, or they're too afraid to because they'll get thrown out of the house. So if we go on, for instance, one of the podcasts I did recently was Everyone's Agnostic, and Cass was quite gracious, but also very unfamiliar with terminology and some of the experiences that we might have. And there were a couple of points in that interview where it was like, oh, this is awkward, but I would rather do that. And then even if the interview goes really bad, which almost never happens, I live with 2 trans partners, and I have that kind of support network that is rare for trans people in this day and age and in this country, although it is improving. But if someone really upsets me and says something terrible, I can screenshot it and 100 people will be there and, validating and supportive. And like I said, there are people who don't have that space anywhere. So if I can explain, maybe you shouldn't ask what someone's genitals are when you first meet them, or, maybe I can define that word so that the trans person in your life who is just now coming out doesn't have to. I feel like that's a valuable thing to do, but we also can't pretend that it doesn't take effort and energy and it doesn't get annoying after a little while sometimes.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it comes down to, generally speaking, humans are social creatures, right? And obviously that exists on a spectrum. Some people are more social, they're less social. But I think on some level, it's at least an adjacent, like basic human need to have connection with other people. And speaking for myself, I know the more of that I have, the easier it is to deal with that kind of stuff. So like when I get, crappy message from someone saying something awful, making threats, any of that kind of stuff, it hurts less because I know I've got an army of people behind me who are going to stick up for me and stand up for me. And so many people don't have that, right? And so having had that experience and like knowing what it's like when people show up to take care of me and defend me, both in private and publicly, then, I want to try to do what I can to be that for other people. And so, yeah.
And one thing I do personally is I'm an internet mom for trans teens, and I have 3 internet trans kids, and just people who reached out who don't have parents supporting them or validating them. And I know how difficult it is to not have somebody to be able to go to with that kind of experience, or to just have someone you can call mom and who will call you by the right name and use the right pronouns. So trying to create something simple like that is just something I do to try to help out the younger translings, as we like to call them.
Hatching baby trans, my favorite pastime.
And I'm convinced that every other trans boy that is a teenager right now is going to be named Logan, because both of my trans internet sons are named Logan, and
I actually know quite a few guys named Logan, so like that's
Logan
really
and
funny.
Aiden, so.
That's great. Well, and I think it's especially important when that person is another trans person, because like I don't want to downplay the support that I got from a lot of my cis friends when I came out. It was super valuable, and I really, really liked it. But getting that coming from someone who also knows that specific experience is huge. And I guess to sort of bring it back around to, what Marissa and I are trying to do with this whole thing is, believe it or not, like there are things specific to podcasting about trans folks, and lots of trans folks have sensitivity around their voices, for example, like me, especially like, it literally, I mean, it was like a hot poker listening to my voice every time when I first started doing podcasting. And like, I'm so glad that some of those older episodes you can't really get anymore. Like they've worked themselves off of iTunes because iTunes only goes back so far. It's like I go back and I listen and I just hate it. Right. And I've had conversations with other trans podcasters about that specific thing, about discomfort surrounding what their voice sounds like on a microphone. Because so much of how we present ourselves has to do with not only the way that we sound, but maybe the way that we look too. And like, speaking for my own experience, some of the way that I used to alleviate that was like, so I'm combining the way that I present with the way that I sound, and hopefully people won't clock me or like say bad things to me because they get that I'm trans, right? And so like I have a super complicated relationship with my voice, and that's something that maybe not only podcasters, but podcasters especially would understand. So like, it's just, one more thing that folks can kind of commiserate on in that area.
Yeah, I know you started podcasting when you were already out. I was already podcasting before I started coming out, and I did like 70 episodes before I came out on my own podcast. So there's this whole backlog where people can go back and listen and hear what I sounded like when I was desperately trying to overcompensate. And I can't do it.
Yes, I'm a dude. Listen, I'm totally a dude, everybody, just so you know. I used to do this, not in a podcasting sense, but I used to do that all the time.
Right. So I even listened to myself a year ago from now, never mind when before I transitioned, and I couldn't do it. Like, it was just, oh God. So we tend to make progress with our voices and then hear how we used to sound. And it's, on one hand, a really great barometer for how far we've come, but on the other, it's like, oh God, did I sound like that? Oh,
right. Like you record a podcast episode when you maybe have a cold or something, and it's a little more difficult to maintain the voice that you want to have. Like, that's happened to me so much. I go back and listen. I'm like, oh my God, I sound like I sound like I did when I started 3 years ago. I hate this.
Right. Exactly. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I caught a bug from the Creating Change conference. And the next day when I got back, I recorded an interview with the host of the Secular Soup podcast. But my voice was so fucked up that I literally had to do like an NPR voice, like, all right, thanks for joining me today.
NPR voice, Trav, that's fantastic.
But fortunately for you, Trav, it was with the Secular Soup podcast, which means you didn't get to say a damn word.
No, actually, they were quite nice to me. Maybe it's because I'm not a cis dude. They had to like give me some slack. But I do want to mention something that y'all mentioned that I've been thinking a lot about lately. I mean, let's face it, with recent stuff that's been going on, it's really got me thinking about. It's pretty much probably got y'all thinking about it as well. What the hell are we doing in this quote unquote atheist movement? How involved should we be? Because it seems like every time you turn around, there's another David Silverman or whatever. But all that's to say that I've been really thinking about well, it's not really about the big names. It's about creating a safe space for young, either queer, trans, or even atheist kids who are starting to, leave their faith or coming out, and they don't have anywhere else to go to talk about this stuff. You know, they know that if they come out to their parents, they're going to get disowned and all that stuff. And so, you know, I think like, you know, one positive thing about we do, not to like, you know, circle jerk each other, but you know, that's sort of our goal, you know, is to create that safe space, that community, so that these you know, people who are either, you know, young queer and trans kids who are leaving their faith, who have nowhere else to go, they can turn to us, you know.
Well, that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately, and I've actually done a couple of podcast episodes where I sort of work through that question, because you know, it becomes a question of, when does a thing become so toxic that you disengage because you don't feel like you can affect a change, or you feel like it's crossed some barrier between I can be a positive voice or a positive influence in this space, and this is gone beyond redemption, right? And I've done a lot of thinking about this, and there are a couple of times where I've gotten so frustrated where I've actually thought about stopping the show, because I just like, I don't want to be associated with this, because there's you know, the bad actors. I mean, if we name all of the bad actors, right, there's not like, I mean, that's not a miles long list, but the really demoralizing thing is how many people show up to apologize for those people, right? And that's like, that's the thing that I've seen. It's like, people like that are going to show up in every community, right? So like, if we decide that we want to be part of another niche, or we want to join another community, I have a very hard time thinking that we won't find similar problems other places, right? But so for me, the question is, so do we remove ourselves from that community completely and thus nullify whatever influence we may have over it, or do we stick around and try to create that space that we want to see? And my thing is, there are lots of people who leave the movement behind because they've been targets and because they've been victims, right? And like 100% supportive of those folks. And I mean, and I have seen dozens and dozens and dozens of people who said, like, it just got so toxic for me that I just can't exist here anymore. And I like, I get that, you know what I mean? Like, if that's what you need to do for your own health and for your own safety, then by all means do that. And you know, I've been able to avoid much of that, aside from in like certain Facebook groups and like random Facebook comments and Twitter messages and that kind of stuff. But like that stuff, at least for me, it's easy to shrug off that stuff because it's not something that happens every day, you know. So it's, even when it gets really bad, it's usually enough for me, like, you know what, I'm just going to turn the phone off and I'm just going to, you know, look at pictures of corgis for the rest of the day, you know. And so for me, the idea is to curate whatever space I have influence over, right? That being, you know, the show that we do. And so I make sure that to whatever extent is possible, that I don't platform bad people, and that I don't platform people who are apologists for those people. And I make that policy explicit, right? I even go as far as like, I'm not going to debate bathroom bills on my show with a Republican. Like, because that's not the space that I want to create. That's not to say that those conversations aren't important. I've sat down across the table from a Republican lawmaker and had to talk about a bathroom bill, because that stuff's important, but that's not what I want my space to be. Like, I want the space that I control to be a place that people can go, and they may hear about hard things. They may hear about tough things and sad things, but it comes from the perspective of, here's this awful problem. How do we fix it? Right. And we want to be part of the solution, and we want to be a positive force. And so I think people who do that stuff are the most valuable players in the movement, right? And I don't mean people with podcasts necessarily. Like, I mean, that's important, right? But the organizers, the people who don't necessarily have the platforms, but the people who build those platforms, right? The people who organize conferences and make an effort to make them safe and inclusive. You know, the people who run local meetup groups and fight for non-discrimination policies and sexual misconduct policies and that kind of stuff. Like, those are the people who are like the MVPs of the movement in my mind. And it's super vital that those folks stick around as long as they feel that it's safe for them to do so. And so that's kind of where I've come down on it. It's just important. Obviously, we want to call out the bad actors, zero tolerance policy for any of that stuff. But in my mind, I don't think, you know, I didn't start doing what I do for the big names in the movement, right? For the heads of the major organizations, for the big podcasters, anything like that. If those people are good people and they're doing good things, I want to be friends with them. I want to work with them. I want to be a part of what they're doing. But that's not why I created the show. I created the show because I felt that there was a specific subset of people who weren't being heard. And I wanted to see if I could build a platform to get those people heard, right? And so I feel like we do at least an okay job of doing that. And I'm doing it without a significant sacrifice to my mental health and my personal safety. So it only makes sense to keep going in the face of that.
I also feel like it's important to point out that the idea that there is a solitary single atheist community is just
Right.
not realistic. And even if it was, if we're talking a quarter of the country's population that identifies in the nuns category, NONES, then it would be ridiculous to expect there not to be spectra of political beliefs and identities and backgrounds. And if we're going to address the problems that we feel within the atheist community, I don't feel like it's responsible to say that you're hurting the movement if, people get called out, or, if you disagree with one of the four horsemen, then suddenly you're putting down the efforts of atheists and, we're burying ourselves, or the left is eating itself, or any of the rhetoric we tend to hear when we have the nerve to exist and assert who we are, or as some people would call it, identity politics. If we try to pretend that just not believing in God is enough and that everything else doesn't matter or is outside of the movement, then it's just a whole bunch of people congratulating each other for what they think they got as the right answer and ignoring everything else, which is why most of us tried to get away from religion in the first place. So like any movement, like any community, like any poker club or whatever, there are going to be people who disagree and can't stand each other and can't be around each other. And it's irresponsible to promote the idea that if people just stopped wanting to exist, that suddenly everything would be completely fine. What we have to do is try to work with the space that we have, like Callie does, and try to make our experience accessible and speak up when we can, and not tolerate toxicity, harassment, assault, and things like that. So trying to create our own sub-community is, the old adage, act locally, all that stuff. So if we do that, if we try to keep our own space in line and try to make it a welcoming space and an accessible one, then I feel like that can work its way upwards. I feel like when you go to a convention that makes specific efforts to acknowledge people of different backgrounds and identities, and like Skepticon I was at last year, and it had a space for pronouns on the name tag. That's nice. Like, just
right. And how difficult is that?
Right. So when we have places like that, places we know that have a reputation for being kind to us and not just platforming one specific voice or a particular set of identity or people and anything like that, that's where we can go to affect our change. And it doesn't mean we take away from the ones who just want to congratulate each other on being smarter than everybody else, but it means it can coexist. We just can't pretend it's one collective group of people and principles.
Yeah, I like to liken it, like, think of a Star Trek convention, right? If you've never been to a Star Trek convention in your life and you go to one, the initial thought is, oh my God, I'm in the same room of thousands of people who love Star Trek, and I love Star Trek. This is amazing. The more time you spend in that space, you're going to start seeking out, like, maybe I want to hang out with other people who think DS9 is the best series. Maybe I want to hang out with other people who think Cisco is the best captain. And you start sort of separating into different interest groups, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? There are people who love the intellectual exercise of debate and philosophy, and those things are valuable as intellectual exercises and as ends to social justice, right? Because there's lots of philosophy in that, and that can be important. And some of us are more interested in specifically the social justice side of things. And I know my advocacy for social justice is rooted in my lack of belief in a God, in the supernatural, right? And so those things aren't separable in my mind, at least not completely. They are very intertwined with one another. And so there are atheist communities I think, there is a cohesive group in that, like, yes, we all don't believe in God, right? And like Marissa said, at first, that may be enough, right? Because society tells you very specifically that you can only be a good person if you believe in God. And you have a huge collective group of people who finally feel comfortable saying, like, no, that's not a thing. That's not right. We can live our lives happily and as positive influences in the world without God. But eventually we have to start asking other questions. Like, okay, so we know what kind of world we don't want to see, which is a theocracy, right? But what do we want to see? We do want to see a world where people can ask these questions, where trans folks can exist and feel safe, where people of color are welcome and not marginalized, et cetera, right? And so that's the space that I have chosen to exist in. It's the space that Marissa has chosen to exist in, because we have both been beneficiaries of spaces where that goal has been met to some degree or another. And so, like, we have a very personal and intimate experience with how valuable that can be. And we're super highly motivated to create as much of that space for other folks as we can.
Exactly. I have a couple of questions here that actually come from Facebook friends, because a couple of hours before this, I posted on my Facebook wall if any of my friends had any questions for us. And it's about 6:45, well, 7 Eastern here. And so I don't think we'll get to all of them, although... let's see here. One of my friends, Summer Salt, asked this: do's and don'ts for allies. What are the best moves you've seen and the worst from people with the best intentions?
Well, I'll give a personal example because it just happened yesterday.
Yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah. So there's, I'm a former professional wrestler, believe it or not. And I have been writing a column reviewing wrestling from the experience of someone who did it for probably 7 years now. And I came out as trans about 2 years ago there as well. So sometimes, at first it was rocky and there were people who made the awful comments and all that, but pretty much anybody who has something horrible to say like that is gone. But this week, someone decided to get on there and say, I'm not trolling, but I have some questions. What is your genitalia? Like, what is your partner? How do you guys have sex? And being an ally in that situation, I screenshotted it because I didn't need to respond. Someone else got in there and said, that's highly inappropriate to ask of a person. Marissa has her email listed up at the top of every column. That's not something you should ask someone in public.
Right.
And that's being an ally. It's speaking up when other people shouldn't have to. And it's speaking up when we're not around. There's been some conversations where I've had to explain to people why there doesn't need to be an S for straight in LGBT, Q+. And it's like, if you want to be an ally, great, but you don't have to entitle yourselves to all of our space, and you're not entitled to answers to every question simply because you don't know. We should try to answer some of them at the same time, but there's a level of appropriate. And on a wrestling column is not the space to ask how me and my partners have sex. It's not okay. So I showed the example of someone saying, hey, she doesn't have to talk about that. And that's not appropriate to ask of a person, especially in public. And one of my favorite examples, again, is one that Callie gives all the time, is sometimes it's just enough to not be the one laughing. When someone says something terrible, whether it's something racist, something sexist, something homophobic, something transphobic, if you don't feel like you can speak up and you don't feel like it's safe to necessarily make a confrontation or have a debate, it can be very powerful to just not be the one laughing.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the broad overview is with any form of allyship really is just to make sure that you're listening and actually listening and not replacing the community's concerns with your own. I've seen so many people so many people wouldn't be transphobic if trans people would just X. Right.
Yeah.
Because so they've recognized that there's a problem, which is good. They've recognized the need for an explicit level of respect for trans folks as a marginalized group and with sort of unique concerns in society. But they did an hour of thinking and think they've figured out the solution and are ready to just steamroll everyone with what they think the solution is, right? And so don't do that.
No.
And do listen. Obviously, you know, no group is a monolith, right? There are lots of trans folks who disagree about, you know, the right ways to address bigotry, the right ways to address transphobia, the right way to address allyship and that kind of stuff. The point is are you listening, and or do you actually have the community's concerns at heart, as opposed to your own, as opposed to your own comfort and your own safety? Not saying you have to give up your own comfort and safety, but in the context of allyship, what really is your priority? Is it the comfort and the safety of the inclusion of the group you purport to be an ally to, or is it your own? And I think that's like, when I see conversations around that, I think that's largely the perspective, right? It's, you know, well, more people would be allies if you would just be nicer, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, one thing I want to add quickly is you don't have to get it. It doesn't have to make sense to you to be an ally and to be inclusive and to be open about that. You don't have to be able to empathize with that experience, because chances are you don't. And that's okay. Just start with the idea that, okay, I've never had to question my gender or sexuality before. Fine. But these people do. And that's okay.
Great. Did we get any questions, Benny?
Yeah, we did. And I would like to put this one out there to you. It's a pretty big one, but I think I'd love to hear all of your opinions. So this question says, I feel that with the growth of atheism, there should be more than one atheist community, including a community that is more inclusive. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think to a degree that already exists, right? I don't think it necessarily exists to the extent that we would like it to. And I would think that, you know, even in spaces that aren't trans-centered necessarily, that trans folks should still feel welcome, right? So there's definitely a ways to go with inclusion across the board. But I do think there are pockets that exist that are already pretty good analogs of that. The problem is that those spaces aren't always accessible to everyone. And I think that's where the problem really comes in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed too. I remember hearing Matt Dillahunty's tell Seth Andrews on the Thinking Atheist, there's no one atheist community, there are several communities. And from my perspective, it seems like, I don't know, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but it seems like at the moment we have three. We've got the secular social justice crowd, which, you know, includes the three of us and folks like Sikivu Hutchins and Sincere Karabo and Diane Burkholder and Stephanie Zavan, who are very, you know, we're using our humanist values, you know, to implement social justice and, you know, positive change in the world. Then you get, you know, the MythCon atheists who basically are like pseudo hyper skeptics who are like, you know what? I've never really considered the Jewish question. That is a valid concern, you know? And then there's pretty much, it seems like most people are in this movable middle, although I don't know, it seems like a lot of the people that I thought were in the movable middle are kind of going more into the MythCon crowd, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just overgeneralizing things, you know?
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't feel that we get a proper look at that, because I don't feel that categorizing a group of people as one of the most extreme examples is healthy, because we exist in a marginalized group that doesn't like being categorized as another. And if we do that to other people, we're not helping ourselves. So once again, it was like I was trying to say earlier, to have this idea that just because we're atheists, we're all going to get along and all have the same values and that there's not going to be terribleness, that would be ridiculous. But I also don't think we need to paint an entire section of that community, if there is a solitary community, with the brush of one of the more extreme and notorious examples.
Yeah, I think we do do a bit of a disservice if we other the folks on that side of things the way that they other us. And obviously the power dynamic is different, so it's not the same thing, right? But I think there's a danger in dismissing them as the other instead of saying like, well, no, like these people exist in our spaces too, right? I think it can turn into, I'm not saying it's this in every situation, but it can turn into well, the problem is with those people over there. The problem is not with us. The problem doesn't exist in our space. Therefore, we have no responsibility to do anything about it because those people aren't us, right? And I think that's a thing that we have to be very, very careful of, because those people, recent examples, obviously, those people very much do exist in our circles. And and I don't want to say that we have to take responsibility for them, obviously, because ultimately a person is responsible for their actions. But I do think we have to have some level of accountability for our own communities and saying like, okay, so we've moved into this house of secular and atheist activism, and therefore it is at least somewhat our responsibility to clean it up if we see that it's dirty and we see that there are people acting badly. And I think, obviously, we don't want to take complete ownership of people who are bad actors, right? Because none of us ask those people to do what they do. But there is a certain level of responsibility for us to hold those folks accountable and to accept, like, we are part of this community. Therefore, we are part of this community, whatever that entails. And so it is incumbent on us to make sure that we're excising that stuff from our spaces after acknowledging that it exists there in the first place, because that's so much of the problem, right? People won't even admit that this is a thing, and it's only that other group over there is where this exists.
Okay. Well, I'm a bit of a salty bitch, and so I'm kind of starting to develop a whole, attitude of, oh yeah, well, I'm going to get my own atheist community with intersectionality and polyamory. In fact, forget the atheism.
No, listen, I've been there. And we had John Pavlovitz on our show, a pretty famous Christian blogger and author. And atheism is an important part of who I am, because being an atheist obviously means certain things for how you navigate society and the societal expectations we live under. But I wouldn't necessarily call it the primary organizing point of my identity or my activism, right? So I get it. Like, I get that impulse.
Gotcha. Let's see here. What if I can do something real quick? Let's
Benny's
see
back.
Here. Oh, Benny. Oh, okay.
Is there others? Are there others?
There is, yeah. So there's about just a few minutes left, and there is one more question.
Sure.
The other question that we got asked was, is transphobia a serious problem in the atheist community? And I think you've answered that pretty clearly. But what I'd like to hear briefly is, how is transphobia in the atheist community different than transphobia experienced elsewhere?
Okay. I might have a perspective on this. When you're in a religious community, and once again, not to paint all religious people under this banner, but you get told you're going to hell and God didn't make you that way, and everything that we can to deny your right to exist or use the bathroom or whatever it is. However, when it's coming from the atheist community, a lot of the straight, cis atheists like to think that they're suddenly experts in biology. And because, they listened to someone who knows something about biology, so therefore they're experts. And they'll often say, like, well, it's just basic science, chromosomes or whatever, or chromosomes or anything like that. Or they're constantly putting gates up in order for people to be believed in who they are. And the implicit idea there is that they have more of a right to our identity than we do. But because they also like to be self-congratulatory on being smarter than everybody else, there's that added aspect of, oh, well, you're just an SJW snowflake or whatever. So it's a lot of the same rhetoric that comes from religious and conservative communities, but it comes under the false guise of skepticism.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of uniqueness in that in some ways atheists are a marginalized group, right? It's obviously not anywhere near the same as racism or transphobia, queerphobia, that kind of stuff. But I mean, in systemic ways, atheists are looked down on and treated differently in society, right? And so there is that that sort of air of like, well, I know what this experience is that you're purporting to experience, and therefore I am more of an expert on this subject than you are. Therefore, I come from a superior, more intelligent, more well-read and skeptical perspective. So I mean, it's kind of like exactly like Marissa was saying. In some ways, it's very much the same. But there is sort of that unique air of superiority and extra intelligence that comes with having figured out an easy question like, does God exist?
Right.
And with that, I think we're just about out of time. Callie, Marissa, and Trav, thank you so much for being here today and for joining us at OrbitCon. This was a great discussion, so I appreciate it. And I'm going to go ahead and just say goodbye, and I'm going to stop the broadcast, okay?
Okay.
All right.
Thanks for having us.
Yay.